Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Friday. And yes, it is showtime. And we are again on the third and the final episode of our best kept secret of the deep state, which we are doing as part 3. And some very interesting the role they play. Can you hear now? Okay. The role they play, the Warburgs and the Wallenbergs of Sweden. Did you hear anything at all? Yeah. Did you hear anything? There we go. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I've had mic issues and it's Friday. So, welcome back. Thank you. And yes, we are on the third episode of the commentary of the best kept secrets of the deep state. So, thank you so much. And grab your beverage of choice, put up your feet, and let's enjoy.
Episode 12. Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell and the Blackmail Business. In this episode, we will take a closer look at one of the many tools of the deep state. The blackmail business. If you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, make sure you follow us on YouTube and Rumble, as this episode contains some supporting graphics. So, seeing as the deep state probably has many different operations of this type, we will look at an example of this, using some familiar names and faces, just to illustrate the amount of control that the deep state has had. It might seem a bit complex, but as you will soon see, everything always ties back to the core of the deep state historically. Knut Agathon Wallenberg was a Swedish banker and politician. He was also a Knight of the Order of the Seraphim. Wallenberg was Minister for Foreign Affairs 1914 to 1917, and member of the Riksdag's First Chamber, the Upper House, 1907 to 1919. Together with his wife, he created Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation, which is one of the main contributors to the private university Stockholm School of Economics. Wallenberg was one of the founders of the Stockholm School of Economics, and is also seen as the founder of the community of Saltsjöbaden and an associated railroad. He also founded the British Bank of Northern Commerce in February 1912, while serving as the CEO of the Stockholm's Enskilda Bank. The British Bank of Northern Commerce was a joint venture by SEB and Landmandsbanken, today called Danske Bank, together with several other banks, including the Norwegian Central Bank, Banque de Commerce de l'Azofdon, and Banque de Paris, Paribas. The purpose of the bank was to facilitate trade between the United Kingdom and Northern Europe. The bank financed Finland after the country achieved its independence from Russia in 1917-18, after the Russian Revolution, which of course had been orchestrated by the deep state. In October 1920, British Bank of Northern Commerce merged with C.J. Hambro and Sons, with the combined bank taking the name Hambro's Bank of Northern Commerce. In August 1921, the bank shortened its name to Hambro's Bank, in part because it did not want a name that was too limiting. Or maybe too obvious. Air Commodore Sir Charles Jocelyn Hambro was a British merchant banker and intelligence officer. Hambro was born into a banking family of Danish Jewish origin which had settled in Dorset and the City of London in the early 19th century. He was the son of Sir Eric Hambro, a partner in C.J. Hambro and Sons. He was also a Conservative Member of Parliament for Wimbledon between 1900 and 1907. He served for 2 years as an officer on the Western Front in the First World War until demobilization. After initially training with the Guaranty Trust Company in New York City, where he and his wife lived with Harry Morgan, he joined his family bank C.J. Hambro and Sons, playing a large part in its merger with the British Bank of Northern Commerce in 1920 to form the Hambros Bank in 1921. In 1928, only 30 years old, Hambro was elected into the Directorate of the Bank of England, and between 1932 and 1933, he worked on establishing the bank's Exchange Control Division, under the direction of Montague C. Norman, the Director of the Bank of England. In 1937, Hambro was asked to succeed Norman as director, but according to the official version, he turned it down as he was suffering from oral cancer, which he would later recover from. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Hambro was placed in charge of activities in Scandinavia, arranging smuggling, intelligence networks and sabotage operations. After the fall of France in June 1940, Hambro was made a colonel on the General Staff and was asked by Ronald Cross to join the Ministry of Economic Warfare, a cover organization for the Special Operations Executive, SOE. The SOE was charged with creating a spirit of resistance in occupied territories. Through his contact with Ebbe Munch, an anti-Nazi journalist, Hambro linked up with the Danish resistance, and was knighted as a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his work, in 1941. Hambro refused to accept any wages for his military work during wartime. Maybe, just maybe, because of less paper trails. Between December 1940 and November 1941, Hambro was also in charge of overseeing the French, Belgian, German, and Dutch sections of the SOE. From November 1941, he was also the deputy leader of the SOE for 5 months. In 1942, he succeeded in persuading the British and Norwegian organizations to form a planning commission, which was instrumental in devising Operation Grouse and Operation Swallow, important parts of the Norwegian heavy water sabotage missions. By this time, Hambro was on the executive committee of the SOE and was promoted to Air Commodore. Roundel Palmer, now head of the SOE, appointed him to succeed Frank Nelson. His first major action as head of the SOE was to meet with Colonel William Joseph Donovan, the head of the OSS. Remember him from the previous episode? Wild Bill Donovan, the deep state operative who after his death was meant to take the fall for the murder of General Patton. Maybe just another coincidence. Later, a disagreement over actions in the Middle East led Hambro to resign in 1943. For the rest of the war, he acted as head of the British Raw Materials Mission in Washington, a cover for exchanging information and technology between Britain and the United States. This was part of the operation which led to the detonation of the first atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project. During the war, Charles Jocelyn Hambro's children lived in Sweden with the Wallenberg family. During this time, they grew up together with Mark Wallenberg and Peter Wallenberg. By the middle of the war, however, they moved to the United States to live with the Morgan family. After the war, Hambro returned to the city, assuming responsibility for the companies with which Hambros were associated. On the death of his uncle, Olaf Hambro, in 1961 he became chairman of Hambros Bank. Whilst maintaining close connection to commerce in Scandinavia, he extended the bank's interests to Africa and Asia. Ian Robert Maxwell MC, born Jan Ludvig Hyman Benjamin Hock, the 10th of June 1923, and dead on the 5th of November 1991, was a British media proprietor, former Member of Parliament, suspected spy, and fraudster. Originally from Czechoslovakia, Maxwell rose from poverty to build an extensive publishing empire. Early in his life, Maxwell, then an Orthodox Jew, escaped from Nazi occupation, joined the Czechoslovak army in exile during World War II and was decorated after active service in the British Army. Maxwell used his contacts with the Allied authorities in Germany to become the managing director of the United States and the British distributor of Springer Verlag, a German publishing house for scientific journals taken over by the Allies. Maxwell was funded initially, which kicked off his quick rise to power, by Sir Charles Hambro, who gave him a checkbook and loan facilities of what would be more than £350,000 today, on no collateral, provided by the deep state. Maxwell was their man. Springer Verlag then merged with the British Butterworth Publishing Company to form the Butterworth Springer Publishing Company. Maxwell then bought 3/4 of Butterworth Springer, while the remaining 1/4 was bought by the Jewish scientific advisor Paul Rosbaud. They then changed the company name to Pergamon Press. The sale was mediated by none other than Charles Hambro, according to British journalist Stephen Dorrell. Maxwell then led a flamboyant life, living in Headington Hill Hall in Oxford, from which he often flew in his helicopter, or sailing in his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. He was litigious and often embroiled in controversy. In 1989, Maxwell had to sell successful businesses, including Pergamon Press, to cover some of his debts. In 1991, his body was discovered floating in the Atlantic Ocean, having apparently fallen overboard from his yacht. He was buried in Jerusalem. Maxwell's death triggered the collapse of his publishing empire as banks called in loans. His sons briefly attempted to keep the business together, but failed as the news emerged that Maxwell had stolen hundreds of millions of pounds from his own company's pension funds. The Maxwell companies applied for bankruptcy protection in 1992. Regardless of what the details of his death really was, the cleanup operation of his dealings started immediately. To draw attention from the fact that Maxwell was deeply in bed with the deep state, and that he almost certainly handled their blackmail operations, they used the pension funds as a diversion. Standard operating procedure of the deep state. Leslie Herbert Wexner, born September 8, 1937, is an American billionaire businessman. Wexner grew a business empire after starting The Limited, a clothing retailer with a restricted selection of profitable items, and later expanded his holdings to include Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, Express Incorporated, and Bath & Body Works. Wexner announced, in February 2020, that he was transitioning from CEO of L Brands into the role of Chairman Emeritus. Wexner had a very close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein that began in the 1980s and continued until Epstein's death. Wexner allowed Jeffrey Epstein to run his business out of a house he owned and resided in whilst CEO of Victoria's Secret. In July 1991, Wexner granted Epstein power of attorney and also instated him as a trustee on the board of the Wexner Foundation. Access to beautiful women is an essential part to these kinds of operations. Victoria's Secret. Secrets indeed. Wexner was really in the same business as Robert Maxwell. The blackmail business. Jeffrey Epstein got control over the Wexner operation in the United States around the same time as Robert Maxwell fell off his boat and drowned. The fact that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of Robert Maxwell, had a very strange relationship might become a little more clear after this episode. Robert Maxwell had been grooming Ghislaine from a young age to someday take over his operations. She was, after all, his favorite child. He even named his yacht after her. The fact that Epstein was a disgusting molester and rapist has been put forth in the media as the aspect in focus. There is no question about that, of course he was, but we must look beyond the surface and see the big picture. In order to run this type of operation successfully, you'd have to be a pretty sick individual in the first place, and Ghislaine Maxwell is surely just as bad as Jeffrey Epstein, if not worse. To make a long story short, two arms of the blackmail businesses of the deep state was consolidated into one. Under new management. The main part of the operation probably took place at Epstein's Islands. Located in the U.S. Virgin Islands, known as Great St. James and Little St. James. These islands have been fairly untouched since Epstein's death in 2019, at least according to the media. Although we know for a fact that the FBI has combed through every square inch of them. We can speculate with pretty good certainty that whatever went on with Epstein, Maxwell and their prominent guests on the island, that everything was being filmed and recorded. Visitors to the island include royalty, heads of state, politicians, actors, tech billionaires, musicians, scientists, and so on. When Epstein died, and Maxwell went into hiding, who took control of the materials? I guess we will find out, sooner or later. We all know that Prince Andrew was deeply compromised by Epstein and Maxwell, as they trafficked young girls for his benefit. The lawsuit against Epstein and Prince Andrew by Virginia Giuffre shines a light at this fact, and is aimed at laying the foundation in the public's mind for what is coming. Let's expand a little bit more. After 2 travel logs from Epstein's private jet with her name on them were released by the court, British writer Clementine "Clemmy" Hambro, a great-granddaughter of Sir Winston Churchill, accompanied Epstein on at least 2 trips, one of which was to his private island. She is of course also related to Charles Jocelyn Hambro. Clementine Hambro was also a bridesmaid to Diana, Princess of Wales, at her wedding with Prince Charles. Prince Charles also had his fingers stuck deep inside the dealings of paedophile Jimmy Savile. Savile is however another story, but perhaps similar in nature. There is also a connection between Epstein, Maxwell, and the Swedish royal family. That connection goes through the Swedish deep state establishment. Barbro Enbom is the daughter of the head of department at the National Audit Office, Bertil Enbom, and Dr. Astrid Gronstedt. During her career, she has worked to promote Swedish-American business collaborations, especially in life science. She has done this not only in her profession as an investment banker, but also at the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce. Enbom has many years of experience in marketing and finance, both in the pharmaceutical industry and entrepreneurship for start-up companies. Barbro Enbom graduated from the Stockholm School of Economics in 1967. She has pursued doctoral studies at the School of Business and Columbia University. Enbom came to work in various roles in the pharmaceutical industry and on Wall Street in the US as a business leader and analyst. Among other things, she was part of the management team for companies that are today part of GlaxoSmithKline. In 2001, Enbom took the initiative to establish the Female Economist of the Year, which is a scholarship awarded annually to a prominent female student at the Stockholm School of Economics. Stockholm School of Economics, if you hadn't put that together yet, is controlled by the Wallenberg family. In the same year, Enbom founded the network BBB, Barbro's Best and Brightest for Young Ambitious Women, initially only for business school students but then expanded to women from other universities and other areas of activity. Today, there are more than 200 members within BBB. The scholarship received the equivalent of at least 1.5 million Swedish krona in donations from Jeffrey Epstein between 2001 and 2014. Stockholm School of Economics terminated its collaboration with Enbom in 2020 in connection with remarks about the Female Economist of the Year's connection to Jeffrey Epstein. In 2022, accusations were made that Enbom had invited several scholarship recipients to meet Epstein. As his conviction was made public, the school downplayed his involvement and continued receiving money. Barbro Enbom, the founder of the scholarship, repeatedly invited young Swedish women to Epstein's luxury home in New York. Dress code: bare legs. Swedish newspaper Dagens etc. revealed new information regarding the decisions made by the School of Economics and confirmed that Epstein approached several of these Swedish women, urging them to find new potential victims. Another way to put it is that they were testing these women to see who could be useful in the blackmail business. High moral fiber is not something that they look for. Like we've said before, access to beautiful women is essential, especially if you can find those with questionable morals. What is the connection to the Swedish royal family? On June 27, 2014, the court announced Swedish Prince Carl Philip and Sofia Hellqvist's engagement. The couple had met in Båstad 5 years earlier, and Sofia was already considered part of the family. The woman who made sure that Sofia had ample coaching before the marriage with the Swedish prince was Barbro Enbom. Barbro Enbom had for a long time been Princess Sofia's mentor. They still have close contact, and Enbom is always a guest when the prince and princess have large parties. Just coincidences, of course. The blackmail business of the deep state is a very old phenomenon. Just to make this very clear, how surprised would you be if we could trace this type of business further back in time? Well, let's give it a go. In 1895, Oscar Wilde brought the Marquis of Queensberry to court, charging him with defamation. The Marquis of Queensberry was the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, with whom he accused Oscar Wilde of having a homosexual relationship. Homosexuality was illegal at the time, and the Marquis had repeatedly tried to bring these activities to light. However, the attorneys for the prosecuted provided evidence that the Marquis' accusations against Wilde for sodomy were justified, and the Marquis was acquitted, at the same time as Wilde was charged with gross indecency, and sentenced to 2 years of penal labor, together with his partner Alfred Taylor. During the trial, it was revealed that Oscar Wilde had extensive contact with extortionists, male prostitutes, crossdressers, and was a frequent visitor to gay brothels. Many were registered and various people involved were interviewed, some being forced to appear as witnesses, because they were also linked to the crimes for which Wilde was charged. During the ongoing trial, many young men from the English aristocracy fled the country to avoid scandal, and one of these men was none other than Claude Danzy, who would become head of the British intelligence service during the Second World War. As we can see, that at the time of Oscar Wilde, the extortion business was already in full swing. Oscar Wilde eventually ending up in a situation where an extortion attempt went wrong, and he landed himself in prison for fornication with other men. After Oscar Wilde's death in the year 1900, his body was moved in 1908 to the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, after it was revealed that an anonymous donor donated £2,000 to a grave monument. The stone was designed as a sphinx, a guardian sculpture where the word originates from the Greek word sphingo, meaning secret keeper, or someone who knows but is not telling. Who was the sculptor of the statue? A certain Jacob Epstein. History has a way of repeating itself. The blackmail business has been a huge and very real part by which the deep state has controlled men and women in powerful positions. To think that anyone could get into a position where they could be a threat to the deep state is not just naive, it's totally out of the question. How do you beat an opponent that has rigged the game, cheats, murders and lies? 1. Unrig the game. 2. Take away their ability to cheat. 3. Take away their toys. 4. Expose the lies. 5. Have them face justice. The best is yet to come. And nothing can stop what is coming. Thank you for listening.
Let's expose the lies, shall we? Can you guys all hear me? Yes, everything is working now. Cool. Next one.
Listeners, you are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement, out of Sweden. Episode 13, The Lord of the Rings and the All-Seeing Eye. If you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, make sure you follow us on YouTube and Rumble, as this episode contains some supporting graphics. Like we've said before, the deep state is a very old entity, but has taken a few different forms over the years. What was once called colonialism now exists in the form of globalism. Remember, controlling money buys control of government. Control of information, money and government buys control of the people. Seeing as the entity we call the deep state have been around for such a long time, there surely must have been people over the years who knew about this hidden structure and have tried to counteract it. Yes. But if they were too vocal about it, more often than not, they would either end up silenced or murdered. Actually, there is no shortage of people that have tried to counteract the deep state over the years, but let's just say they were not always successful. At least not until now. We will in this episode have a look at a certain individual that without question knew a lot about the deep state and did his best to expose what he could manage. John Ronald Royal Tolkien, born the 3rd of January 1892 in Bloemfontein, in present-day South Africa, and died the 2nd of September 1973 in Bournemouth, Dorset, United Kingdom. He was a British author, philologist and university professor, and best known as the author of the fantasy novels The Lord of the Rings. Already as a child he showed a fantastic language ability, and as a young student he was fascinated by the Kalevala epic. Kalevala is a Finnish and Karelian national epic. It is a heroic poem in 50 songs, which is characterized by alliterations and a special rhythm. Based on that, he created all the fairy tales, languages and worlds that today can be seen as one of the cornerstones of the fantasy genre. Tolkien, who was a professor of Anglo-Saxon in Oxford, was also fluent in Nordic languages and could read, among other things, Swedish. It is also the Nordic languages that form the basis of his own language, which he incorporated into The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was also friends with another master, C.S. Lewis, whose books on Narnia have captivated generations of children. Tolkien studied English and English literature at the University of Oxford, majoring in philology. He was a signal officer in the British Army during the First World War, and took part in the Battle of the Somme. He contracted trench fever in late 1916 and spent the rest of the war in England. Meanwhile, on the home front, he began work on his legend, which would not appear in print until 4 years after his death, in the book Silmarillion, in 1977. Seeing as he had served as a signal officer in the First World War, by the time the Second World War came around, Tolkien was earmarked as a code breaker. In January 1939, he was handpicked to serve in the cryptographic department of the Foreign Office, in the event of national emergency. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Government Code and Cipher School, which became known as GCHQ in April 1946, ran courses for handpicked individuals from universities who might join the organization in the event of war. As seen on this list from the GCHQ, Tolkien would take part in the Scandinavian and Spanish areas of study. He is even written down as keen, meaning he was eager to take part in the studies. By late October 1939, Tolkien was informed that his services would no longer be required. In short, they didn't want him anywhere near signal intelligence. We could speculate quite extensively about the reason the GCHQ decided to end Tolkien's engagement as a codebreaker, but as we will try to show in this episode, it was probably because he was a bit too clever for his own good. What if we told you that Tolkien probably had his suspicions, that something didn't quite add up? Remember, he had served in the First World War as a signal officer, but now the GCHQ didn't want his services. We are willing to bet that Tolkien might have been a little too open about his suspicions. It's very hard to find anything today that relates to Tolkien's dismissal from the GCHQ. The official statement from the GCHQ completely contradicts what Tolkien himself has written. The statement reads as follows. Although he has keen written after his name, possibly indicating he was willing to undertake such work, in the end, he did not join us. Alternatively, keen could simply be a note on how to pronounce Tolkien. We'll probably never know which meaning was intended. Well, either Tolkien was considered a liability due to his insights about the world, or he simply decided not to take part in the charade. It doesn't really matter, as both alternatives are probable. So, how can we be sure that Tolkien actually, so to speak, knew too much? Let's just say that he tells us, through the Lord of the Rings novels. Tolkien actually exposes several parts of what we call the deep state, although shrouded in metaphors and similes. The name The Lord of the Rings is actually a play on words, pointing to the governor of the Bank of England, a man called Montague Collet Norman. A collet is a subtype of chuck that forms a collar around an object, to be held, and exerts a strong clamping force on the object, when it is tightened. In short, a ring that exerts pressure around one's neck. The rings, in the novel, symbolizes the central banks in each country, exerting pressure around the neck of the population, through debt. The Bank of England is the central bank of the United Kingdom. The Lord of the Rings metaphorically describes the banking system with the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, with the national central banks as intermediaries, and the regional banks, as the ultimate executive unit against the population. Rings within a ring. This is the system of rings that colonial empire creators, such as Cecil Rhodes, called round table conferences, and as described by Professor Carol Quigley in the book Tragedy and Hope, we know these rings within the BIS and the IMF as the Bilderberg Group. G20, the Trilateral Commission and the Foreign Policy Institutes. This is masterfully thought out by Tolkien, who in addition to writing fairy tales and being a professor of Old Norse languages at Oxford, was also a committed debater on the financial systems and their contemporary course and origins. So, we've established that the rings symbolize the banks. Well, what about Sauron's all-seeing eye that sits on top of Mountain Barad-dûr? Well, who surveils everything? Who sees all? This is, of course, also a metaphor. Let us introduce the telephone tower in Stockholm. The telephone tower was completed in 1887 and was a 50-meter high truss tower on Malmskillnadsgatan that collected 4,000 telephone wires in Stockholm. In the building below, switchboard operators sat and connected the calls. Of course, it would never occur to them to have wiretapping activities in the same building. The telephone tower had been commissioned by Stockholm's Public Telephone AB, a company that would later merge with Ericsson. Go back and listen to episode 2, where we explain more about the company called Ericsson. Pretty soon, the public and the press thought that the tower was ugly and that a decoration was needed. A prize competition was then announced for the decoration of the tower. The competition was won by J. Zetterstedt, who was an official at the company. The proposal was substantially reworked by the architect Fritz Eckert around 1890, and the tower got the 4 corner towers with pennant poles. At all major events in the city, it was decorated with flags. There were also smaller telephone towers at the company's substations on Svartmangatan 6 and Hornsgatan 9. As early as the beginning of the 1890s, the wires began to be joined together in underground cables. Around 1913, the rebuilding was completed, and the telephone tower lost its function, even though individual wires remained. Having the cables hanging in the sky above Stockholm was blocking the sun for the inhabitants. Did the sun ever shine in Mordor? In 1939, a rotating clock was mounted on the tower, the so-called NK clock. The dial has a diameter of 7.6 meters and was then Europe's largest. The NK clock was manufactured in 1939 by the company ASEA. ASEA, just like Ericsson, is also controlled by the Wallenberg family, through their investment company Investor. I'm sure you remember the swastika in the old ASEA logotype. The entire clock weighs 7 tons, and the NK clock became a popular feature in the cityscape. If you look at the telephone tower with its rotating clock at the top, what sort of parallels can you draw? Needless to say, Tolkien's metaphor for the all-seeing eye of Sauron was the NK clock. All-seeing, as it symbolizes the surveillance that Ericsson conducts through the telecommunications infrastructure. Remember, the deep state control both money and information, and Tolkien had a very good idea as to how. After Tolkien got into a dispute with his publisher, George Allen and Unwin, who didn't want to publish his novel, he had to turn to publisher William Collins in 1950. Tolkien intended the Silmarillion, itself largely unrevised at this point, to be published along with The Lord of the Rings, but Allen and Unwin were unwilling to do this. Milton Waldman, his contact at Collins, expressed the belief that The Lord of the Rings itself urgently needed cutting. After several back and forths with the publishers, Tolkien eventually got frustrated and demanded that they publish the book in 1952. Collins refused. On Wednesday, July 23, 1952, a fire broke out in Televerket's radio laboratory, which was housed underneath the telephone tower, causing severe damage to the tower and the rest of the building. The very next day it was decided that the tower would have to be demolished. Tolkien again wrote to Allen and Unwin, saying, "I would gladly consider the publication of any part of the books," fearing his work would never see the light of day. One might think that somebody with influence didn't want the books published, or at least, to delay the publication. In 1953, the telephone tower was finally demolished, officially citing the reason being that the risk of it collapsing was too great. So the tower had stood for almost a year after the fire, but the risk of collapse was still too great for it to stay in place. The NK clock was dismantled shortly before the telephone tower was demolished, but reassembled within a year at its current location, on the department store NK's roof. There had been plans to turn the telephone tower into a skyscraper, but because of the fire, this never happened. Delays in producing appendices, maps and indexes led to The Lord of the Rings being published later than originally planned. The first book was published on the 29th of July 1954, the second on the 11th of November 1954 and the third on the 20th of October 1955, in the United Kingdom. When the books got out to the public, the telephone tower was gone. There are many more metaphors in the books, but we've chosen this one because it is central to the story. Another metaphor is that of a certain Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil is the name of a character in Tolkien's Legendarium, and he is also featured in The Lord of the Rings. Although Bombadil was omitted from Peter Jackson's film trilogy, the 1978 film and radio adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, as considered non-essential to the story, when he is in fact anything but. Due to Tom Bombadil's different nature, many of Tolkien's readers have speculated about him. Various attempts have been made to explain who he really is, and to make him fit into Tolkien's mythology. Tolkien, however, deliberately left Tom Bombadil a mystery. Tolkien was well versed in the Swedish language and culture and probably even the mentality of the Swedish people. In The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo stays at Tom Bombadil's house, he asked the question to his wife. "Who is Tom, really?" She replies, "He is the master of wood, water and hill." That didn't really mean anything to Frodo, and what could that possibly mean? So maybe it's another metaphor. What is made using these three components? Wood, water and hills. At least since the 12th century, hydropower has been used in Sweden to take advantage of forests and ores. Around the year 1200, the first hydropower plants in the Nordic countries were built. For almost 700 years, hydropower has been used in the Nordic countries, and has long been owned and controlled by the monarchy. The crown had ownership of all major watercourses, along with associated hydropower. By using more modern hydro plants, Sweden was later the first country in Europe to receive electricity. Härnösand was one of the first cities in Europe to have street lighting in 1885. Thanks to hydropower, Sweden also was the first country in the world to have electric trains. If any country would be considered the master of wood, water and hill, it's Sweden. Tom Bombadil is described as a happy person wearing a blue coat, yellow boots and a feather in his hat. As he is somewhat of a pacifist and seemingly benevolent, he took no open stance against the Dark Lord. He is also carefree and oblivious to the troubles of the world, and is unaffected by the power of the ring. Remember, Sweden remained unaffected during both world wars, and has in general, probably the world's most mentally formatted population. And we do find it a bit strange that the connection between Tom Bombadil and Sweden hasn't been made earlier, seeing as the colors of his outfit should give the metaphor away, almost instantly. It's our opinion that Tolkien was both pointing a finger at Sweden as a country, as well as being a satire of the Swedish people's mentality. The last example of a metaphor we will touch on is the fact that Frodo was taking the One Ring to Mordor, as it had to be destroyed in the same fire that it had been forged in. Seeing as the rings symbolize the central banks, it could be argued that the idea of central banking had to be destroyed at its place of origin. Do you remember where the world's first central bank was established? Sweden. In 1668. Most metaphors in The Lord of the Rings fell on deaf ears, but by this time, it's quite easy to see where the geopolitical events of today is going to lead eventually. History is being unraveled in reverse, and the core of the deep state is in Sweden. Maybe it's only a coincidence that the people counteracting the deep state uses a lot of Lord of the Rings references. If you look for it, you will find it. Thank you for listening.
How interesting is that? Wow. And you do know, I don't know if he actually mentioned that in the beginning, but Tolkien is actually born in South Africa. He's a South African. He was born in Bloemfontein on the 3rd of January, 1892, but his mother took him and his brother back to England when he was about 3 years old after his father's death. He spent the rest of his childhood and nearly all his adult life in England. And then it's also interesting, an interesting question is whether South Africa influenced his imagination. Tolkien himself had only the faintest childhood memories of the country, describing it as a hot country. Some scholars and fans have speculated that early memories, stories he heard, or even his childhood encounter with a large spider may have contributed to elements of his later mythology. So very interesting, because if I remember anything about that, it's the spider. So I just love where this is going, I have to say, because the symbology in the Lord of the Rings is actually quite astounding. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. So drop a comment and let me know. And where am I now? Yes, I think we are on episode 14.
You are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement out of Sweden. Episode 14. Money Mechanics, the Foundation of Globalism. If you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, make sure you follow us on YouTube and Rumble, as this episode contains some supporting graphics. As we established in our previous episode with the help from the Lord of the Rings novels, our monetary system is a system of control. The rings within a ring. One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. To help illustrate how this control over entire populations is expanded and maintained, we will in this episode go into more detail on how money is created. Money is created the moment a bank issues a loan. The loan consists of a principal amount, a term, and an interest rate. The principal amount is the same as the face value of a loan. A term is the amount of time it takes to eliminate the debt. The interest rate is the amount charged on top of the principal amount by a lender to a borrower. The bank records the loaned credit as a deposit in their balance sheet. At the same time, the same amount is posted to your account that you can then spend. Now, the same amount of money as the principal amount has been created. The money needed to pay the interest, however, has not been created. This means that for every credit created, there is a deficit for the repayment of the loan. This means that in order to pay the interest, more money needs to be created. Another indebtment has to be made, also with interest attached. And in order to pay the interest on that debt, more money needs to be created, also with attached interest. And so on, and so on. This means that the deficit in the economy is getting bigger and bigger as it accumulates over time. This is called compounding interest. Due to this fact, more and more credits are constantly needed to be able to support the cost for the compounding interest. What happens at a given point in time is that the system becomes saturated with debt. This is called the debt saturation point. What does that mean then? Well, it means that for every newly created unit of money, more than half of the value of that money will be needed to support the cost of previously created money. The problem keeps getting kicked down the road and is also made worse and worse. What then happens is that the financial part of the economy, where trading in stocks, currencies, and other debt-based financial instruments are conducted, needs such a large inflow of money due to the ever-growing interest cost that the money available in the real economy will decrease. The accumulated interest cost sucks the money out of the real economy and funnels it into the financial economy. This has to happen in order to continue supporting the interest cost for previously created money. This phenomenon is called real economy deflation. This means that the flow of money to a greater extent flows out of the real economy and into the financial economy. The direction of the flow of money is out of the real economy and into the financial economy. This causes a deflation of the real economy. This large inflow of money into the financial economy leads to a rise in financial asset prices. The price of shares and other financial assets then begin to rise, at the same time as the real economy is shrinking. As the real economy shrinks, the public's ability to consume goods and services decreases, and this leads to the real economy stagnating. We then have a deflationary and stagnant real economy, at the same time as we have financial asset price inflation in the financial economy. The collective term for this condition is called stagflation. At this point, the only thing that can be done to delay a system collapse is to expand the credit mass even more. Which means creating even more interest-bearing credits, while dialing down the only parameters at their disposal. 1. The interest rate, the cost of money, must go towards zero. 2. Credit times, length of loans, must go towards infinity. 3. Credit worthiness, must go towards zero. More people need to borrow money. But this seems completely crazy, right? Why do we have an economic system that from the very beginning is doomed to crash? Well, it's because those who control the banks make money of the system. It's that simple. When a bank can create money out of nothing by putting people in debt to the bank, and at the same time get paid for this magic trick, which is really no less than a pure fraud, these people who control the banking system will always try to perpetuate the illusion and protect the system. If the system fails, everyone will quickly realize that the value of the bank's fictitious digital confetti does not consist of anything at all, except the fact that everyone believed it had a value. It is said that the system is based on trust, and that is exactly what is meant. The second you understand how the system works, you realize that it can never work, and then the trust completely disappears. Those who control and profit from the economic system must therefore ensure that the public never understand the basic mechanics of how money is created. Since all money in our monetary system is based purely on debt, with an attached cost, called interest, the banks have done their best to make the system seem very complicated. No matter what they call different types of financial instruments, be it debentures, bonds, deposits, notes or commercial paper, its basis is still only debt, with a principal amount, a term and an interest rate. The term credit was first used in English in the 1520s. The term has traveled through different languages over the years, from Middle French credit, meaning belief or trust, from Italian credito, and from Latin creditum, meaning a loan, a thing entrusted to another, from the word credere, to trust, entrust, or believe. But the first creditors dates even further back in time. It actually dates all the way back to 3500 BC, in the Sumerian civilization. The Sumer was the first urban civilization, with about 89% of its population living in cities, where it is thought that consumer loans, used for agricultural purposes, were first used. Then in 1800 BC, in the Babylonian Empire, the Code of Hammurabi was written, formalizing the first known laws around credit. Hammurabi established the maximum interest rates that could be used legally, 33.3% per year on loans of grain, and 20% per year on loans of silver. Babylon was a historic example of debt slavery. One might wonder if we have learnt anything from history. Buying a house, for example, with money borrowed from the bank, is called asset-based lending. Asset-based lending is any kind of lending secured by an asset. In this case, the house. The market value of the house reflects what is called the collateral value. This means, if the loan is not repaid, the house is taken by the bank. If the collateral value of the house doesn't cover the loan, you will still be in debt, even if the house is no longer yours. Since more and more money is constantly needed to cover the cost for the compounded interest, prices on assets, no matter what kind of asset, also have to keep rising. Like we've already said, since the system is always destined to crash, the collateral value of these assets will never be able to cover the debts. But why hasn't anyone said something? In fact, there are a lot of people who over the years have tried to point out this obvious problem. The explanation as to why people who criticize the system must always be discredited or otherwise slandered is because of what we said before: the system is based on trust. The system only works if we all believe in it. Why haven't economists and credit lawyers kicked and screamed in protest? Well, the answer to that question is probably a mixture between their own intellectual shortcomings and pure self-interest. Those who have understood the system have either kept their mouths shut and played along in the charade, or they have been silenced. Controlling money is the foundation of what we today call globalism, and is the most important tool of the deep state. Globalism is in fact not that different from colonialism, as it is all about controlling the world's natural resources. There is today little need for invading countries where they already control the economic system and the political agenda. If you want to be able to predict geopolitical and economic trends with any kind of accuracy, you must first accept a few harsh realities. First of all, the majority of cultural change and tax development within our system is a product of influencing public opinion through organized but competitive collectives. Secondly, you must understand that this collective polarization game is driven by the ideology of globalism, which is the pursuit of total centralization of economic and political control in the hands of a few individuals who consider themselves superior to all other people. Neutral is a term that demonstrates the relationship to a conflict between two parties, where the neutral is the third party who leads the conflict through the strategy of acting without being seen, avoiding paying the price of the created conflict. As the globalist insider, CFR member and mentor to Bill and Hillary Clinton, Carroll Quigley, openly admitted in his book, Tragedy and Hope. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching goal and purpose, namely nothing more than to create a world system of economic control in private hands that could dominate each country's political system and the world economy as a whole. Controlled in a seemingly openly feudalist way, the world's central banks acting in politically planned strategic consensus through secret agreements that have emerged at frequent private meetings and conferences. The pinnacle of the system was the creation of the Bank of International Settlement, BIS, in Basel, Switzerland. The BIS is a private bank, owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which to one decisive extent was in turn controlled by private companies, politically independent. Every central bank tried to dominate its government, through its ability to control government debt. Also to manipulate foreign stock markets, to influence economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians, through subsequent economic rewards in business. In other words, to control the economy, and the politicians, which in turn controls the politics. All through confidence-building measures for the system, while in fact it was always the private banks themselves that controlled the amount of money circulating, through their lending. The philosophical basis of globalist ideology is perhaps most clearly summed up in the principles of something called Fabian socialism. A system founded in 1884 that promotes the subversive and deliberate manipulation of the general masses towards total centralization, psychosocial control, collectivist materialism, and population control through eugenics. Globalists therefore prefer to implement their strategies for many decades, to transform a population slowly, rather than to try to force changes in a system immediately. Their symbol is a coat of arms showing a wolf in sheep's clothing, or in some cases a turtle, sometimes pictured with the phrase, "When I strike hard." Another familiar phrase that speaks to their method is to act without being seen. Again, it is important to recognize that these people are not united by loyalty to any nation, culture, political party, traditional religion, or ethnic background. In fact, they are happy to sacrifice any country or any of the above groups of people if it will bring them closer to their goal. Total global dominance. They are not defenders of the free market that idiots on the far left tend to claim. In fact, they detest all business models that are not dominated by a self-controlled government and a bureaucracy that is designed to give them an unfair advantage through legislation. Anyone who believes that free markets are the cause of our economic problems over the past decade has lost perspective on the fact that the markets were never free, ever. Globalists are also not loyal to any particular theological tradition, at least not one that is clearly identified. Of course, many believe that they are organized around Judaism, or even have a kind of loyalty to Israel. This is the common argument in what is now called the alternative right. Globalists don't care about Jewish people or Jewish beliefs, even though some of the globalists choose to call themselves Jews. Judaism is a geopolitical strategic tool for the globalists, and nothing else. The country called Israel was created as a geographical manifestation of this strategic geopolitical tool. It's that simple. Have you ever bothered to look at Israel's borders on a map, seen through the perspective of controlling the flow of natural resources from Africa? So, while a minority of globalists are still associated with the political extremist faction called Zionism, the Zionists are just another exploitable group for the globalists. Their larger goals have nothing at all to do with the glorification of religious romance and Israel. For example, they are perfectly happy to fund Islamic extremist groups, such as those with a desire and willingness to carry out the annihilation of Israel, or the murder of the Jewish people, if this would benefit their strategic goals. They are therefore also using elements of the Israeli government in order to unleash chaos on the other side of the chessboard when needed. And things are indeed looking a bit dark for the people of Israel. The American Jewish lobby is now more or less paralyzed by this realization. There is no longer any possibility of the United States going to war for Israel, as the American people are tired of fighting other countries' wars. Those who argue that all our problems are constructed by the Jews or the Khazarian cabal is misinformed and has chosen an overly simplistic answer for a much more complicated enemy. They therefore usually cite evidence that is unconfirmed and poorly obtained. Some people are quick to believe that the Rothschilds are the basis of all globalism, when the Rothschilds today are a clearly subordinate element in a larger function of power through the global deep state. This is an enemy who has no loyalty to anything other than his own self-interests. Ask yourselves which globalist institutions within the deep state are actually arguing for ultimate total Jewish or Zionist supremacy. There is no compelling evidence pointing in this direction, other than the obvious backdrop of a manufactured baby-eating Khazarian mafia, which is a myth perpetuated by the same globalist interest that don't want you focused on what is really going on. All the globalist institutions in the deep state and their apologists actually openly argue for globalism, even at the expense of all Jewish people and Israel as a country. The deep state globalists have supported both fascism, communism, and whatever other ism was needed at the time in order to further their agenda. The very foundation of the deep state's power lies in the creation of money and is maintained by the control of information. The deep state no longer have a total control of information, nor do they have control over the economic system. This economic system has in fact already collapsed, it's just not obvious to everyone yet. The deep state is being exposed for all to see. So, what comes next? Stay tuned. Nothing can stop what is coming is not just a catchphrase. Thank you for listening.
Okay, guys, well, we've got one more because it's the final one. So we are going over a little more than an hour. But yeah, we have one more. Very interesting.
Listeners, You are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement, out of Sweden. Episode 15. Roe v. Wade. The Hidden Agenda. If you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, make sure you follow us on YouTube and Rumble, as this episode contains some supporting graphics. We will in this episode dive into history, to shine light on what Roe v. Wade was really all about. But first we will provide a bit of background. Until the late 19th century, abortion was legal in the United States before quickening, the point at which a woman could first feel movement of the fetus, typically around the 4th month of pregnancy. Some of the early regulations related to abortion were enacted in the 1820s and 1830s and dealt with the sale of dangerous drugs that women used to induce abortions. Despite these regulations and the fact that the drugs sometimes proved fatal to women, they continued to be advertised and sold. In the late 1850s, the newly established American Medical Association began calling for the criminalization of abortion, partly in an effort to eliminate doctors' competitors, such as midwives and homeopaths. Additionally, some nativists, alarmed by the country's growing population of immigrants, were anti-abortion because they feared declining birth rates among white, American-born, Protestant women. In 1869, the Catholic Church banned abortion at any stage of pregnancy, while in 1873, Congress passed the Comstock Law, which made it illegal to distribute contraceptives and abortion-inducing drugs through the U.S. mail. By the 1880s, abortion was outlawed across most of the country. During the 1960s, during the women's rights movement, court cases involving contraceptives laid the groundwork for Roe v. Wade. To gain more public support for abortion, several court cases were driven forward, with the intent to make birth control inaccessible and to lay the groundwork for making use of the 14th Amendment, the right to privacy, in regards to abortions. In 1965, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a law banning the distribution of birth control to married couples, ruling that the law violated their implied right to privacy under the U.S. Constitution. And in 1972, the Supreme Court struck down a law prohibiting the distribution of contraceptives to unmarried adults. Then came Roe v. Wade. It became a landmark legal decision, issued on January 22, 1973, in which the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a Texas statute banning abortion, effectively legalizing the procedure across the United States. The court held the opinion that a woman's right to an abortion was implicit in the right to privacy, protected by the 14th Amendment in the Constitution. Making the courts argue, in previous cases, that the right to privacy was connected to the use of contraceptives, they now used the same rhetoric regarding abortion. Which was the plan all along. Meanwhile, in 1970, Hawaii became the first state to legalize abortion, although the law only applied to the state's residents. That same year, New York legalized abortion, with no residency requirement. By the time of Roe v. Wade in 1973, abortion was legally available in both Alaska, New York, Hawaii, and Washington. Jane Roe, whom we now know as Norma McCorvey, was just 21 years old when she became pregnant for the third time and sought an abortion in the state of Texas. Texas law, however, stated that a woman could only undergo an abortion if the mother's life was at risk. McCorvey was put in contact with two lawyers, Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington, who were looking for a pregnant woman to help them build a case to legalize abortion. McCorvey lied and said she had been raped. That lie became the basis for the legal fight against the district attorney of Dallas County, Henry Wade. The lawyers knew that the case would never be finished in time for McCorvey to get an abortion, and she ended up giving birth and placing the child for adoption. In 1994, McCorvey published her autobiography, I Am Roe. At a book signing, McCorvey was befriended by Flip Benham, an evangelical minister, and the national director of the anti-abortion organization Operation Rescue. She converted to evangelical Protestantism and was baptized on August 8, 1995, by Benham in a Dallas, Texas, backyard swimming pool, an event that was filmed for national television. 2 days later, she announced that she had quit her job at an abortion clinic and had become an advocate of Operation Rescue's campaign to make abortion illegal. She voiced remorse for her part in the Supreme Court decision and said she had been a pawn for abortion activists. In 2004, McCorvey sought to have the U.S. Supreme Court overturn Roe v. Wade, saying that there was now evidence that the procedure harms women, but the case was ultimately dismissed in 2005. On January 22, 2008, McCorvey endorsed Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul because of his anti-abortion position. McCorvey appeared in the 2013 film Doomby, in which she delivers an anti-abortion message. She is also the subject of Joshua Prager's 2021 book, The Family Roe, An American Story. She then switched sides again. In a documentary, aka Jane Roe, that premiered on TV station FX, which was filmed at her nursing home, in the year before her death, an ailing McCorvey comes out with a self-described shocking deathbed confession. The whole thing was a lie, one that the evangelical movement apparently paid her hundreds of thousands of dollars to participate in. I was the big fish to them, she says dispassionately, breathing through an oxygen tube. I think it was a mutual thing. I took their money, and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say. When the pro-abortion movement used her to get Roe v. Wade passed, she played along, for her own benefit. When the evangelical pro-life movement offered her money to switch sides, she played along once more. We're guessing that she also was well compensated for the new documentary. Self-serving, to the end. The fact that Norma McCorvey has played both sides of the abortion issue for money only speaks to her own moral shortcomings. The facts are still the facts. On Friday, June 24, 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. This ruling solidifies a decades-long pursuit of the Republican Party in appointing conservative justices to the highest court in the country, one of the defining legacies of Donald Trump's presidency, who appointed Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, all of whom counted among the 6-3 majority ruling, alongside Justice Clarence Thomas, who was appointed by President George W. Bush. Justice Samuel Alito penned the court majority, arguing that the 1973 ruling and repeated subsequent high court decisions, affirming Roe, must be overruled because they were egregiously wrong, with exceptionally weak arguments that were so damaging they amounted to an abuse of judicial authority. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote a separate concurring opinion. So, the Supreme Court has now asserted that the right to an abortion is not within the rights afforded to every citizen per the Constitution, and that it's up to the respective states to legislate on this issue. So, what's all the fuzz about? Why is it so important to the radical left and the mainstream media to have the right to abortion cemented in the Constitution? Simple question, with some sinister answers. Here is a short clip with Margaret Sanger, founder of the American Birth Control League, which later became the American arm of Planned Parenthood, but more on that later.
Do you believe in sin? When I say believe, I don't mean believe in committing sin. Do you believe there is such a thing as sin?
Well, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically, delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin that people can commit.
Murder is a sin.
Well, that's naturally a thing. Murder is a sin or not. It's a terrible act.
In New York City, she organized the first birth control clinic to be staffed by all-female doctors, as well as a clinic in Harlem. The Negro Project was an initiative conceptualized by Margaret Sanger. The aim of the project was officially to spread awareness of contraception, to lower poverty rates in the South. What could the real reason have been? While the world would rightly condemn the Nazis for their worldview of eugenics, few people realize that Margaret Sanger, founder of American Planned Parenthood, held the same ideas and beliefs as Hitler did. The goal of her organization, the Birth Control League, later to be named Planned Parenthood, was to help create a superior race, a racially evolved mankind, as we will soon see. In her book, Woman and the New Race, Sanger mentions 3 different viable options for removing unfit people from society. Option number 1, the brutish method of war. This is the option Hitler chose and which Sanger agreed with, in order for Germany to purify itself from overpopulation, and from weak and inferior people. War wasn't her personal approach, but she agreed that Hitler's argument was sound. Though she would conveniently criticize Hitler later once his belief in eugenics came under attack. Option number 2, to let the defectives and stupid people die out, by allowing disease and other natural remedies to take their toll and lead them to their natural end. In other words, do not work to save the sick and dying people of society. Just let them die. This is one reason that Sanger abhorred the Catholic Church and her charities, because it just kept these defectives alive longer and used up precious resources. She has a whole chapter in her book vehemently attacking charities. Option number 3, by using birth control, sterilization and segregation, which she called the more sane and civilized approach to racial superiority. She had the same philosophy and goal as Hitler, just a different method. For Sanger, birth control, segregation, sterilizations, and abortion if necessary, could help the population to evolve faster by removing weak people, weak in mind, body, health, and economic conditions. Thus, while she may have ideas to help women and help make healthier families in some sort of warped way, her motives were completely eclipsed from the start due to the bizarre worldview from which she operated. While trying to help women, she simultaneously sought to weed out inferior races and unfit people, including women, ironically, and with force if need be. Sanger also wrote a book entitled The Pivot of Civilization. In it she states, birth control is the pivot of civilization. Birth control, which has been criticized as negative and destructive, is really the greatest and most truly eugenic method, and its adoption as part of a program of eugenics would immediately give a concrete and realistic power to that science. As a matter of fact, birth control has been accepted by the most clear-thinking eugenists as the most constructive and necessary means to racial health. Margaret Sanger also wrote, the most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the overfertility of the mentally and physically defective. Possible drastic and even Spartan methods may be forced upon American society if it continues complacently to encourage the chance and chaotic breeding that has resulted from our stupid, cruel sentimentalism. Sanger continues, the emergency problem of segregation and sterilization must be faced immediately. Every feeble-minded girl or woman of the hereditary type, especially of the Moran class, should be segregated during the reproductive period. Otherwise, she is almost certain to bear imbecile children who in turn are just as certain to breed other defectives. The male defectives are no less dangerous. Segregation carried out for 1 or 2 generations would give us only partial control of the problem. She continues, when we realize that each feeble-minded person is a potential source of an endless progeny of defect, we prefer the policy of immediate sterilization, making sure that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded. Margaret Sanger's ideas about eugenics are shared by many more people. As a more recent reference, she has been celebrated and praised repeatedly by Hillary Clinton. 3 international eugenics congresses took place between 1912 and 1932 and were the global venue for scientists, politicians, and social leaders to plan and discuss the application of programs to improve human heredity in the early 20th century. This spun into many different arms of the same sinister beast. We will go through a couple of examples. Please research these names and organizations for yourselves, as they are deeply connected to the geopolitical and social developments of the last century. The Galton Institute in the United Kingdom, founded by Sybil Gotto in 1907 as the Eugenics Education Society, with the aim of promoting the research and understanding of eugenics. We cannot stress the importance of this organization enough. Go onto Wikipedia and look at the complete list of its members. It consisted of many prominent members, for example, Arthur Balfour, issuer of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a letter to Lord Rothschild affirming the government's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire. John Maynard Keynes, English economist whose ideas fundamentally changed the theory and practice of macroeconomics and the economic policies of governments. Margaret Sanger was of course also a prominent member of this organization. Our last example of a prominent member of the Institute was Alfred Ploetz, who first proposed the theory of racial hygiene, race-based eugenics, in Germany, in his Racial Hygiene Basics, Grundlinien einer Rassenhygiene, in 1895. He also sat on the Nazis' Expert Advisory Committee for Population and Racial Policy together with a man called Ernst Rudin. Rudin oversaw the German Institute for Psychiatric Research under the umbrella of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. Rudin was among the first to write about the dangers of hereditary defectives and the supposed value of the Nordic race as culture creators. Funding for this institute came primarily from the American Rockefeller Foundation. What are the odds? As far as coincidences go, International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPPF, was founded by Swedish RFSU and other actors, and the RFSU remains IPPF's Swedish member association. The RFSU was founded in 1933 and is a pioneering Swedish organization working in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Let's see what they themselves write on their website. RFSU advocates and influences Swedish and international agreements on sexual and reproductive health and rights. Much of this work is done with partners. For us, partnership is a fundamental way of working. We channel support to civil society organizations in a number of countries. We also work with organizations and networks in Brussels, Geneva, and New York to secure strong support for our cause in international agreements, and to ensure their implementation. If you think that this organization share the same view on eugenics as Margaret Sanger did, you'd be right. The founder of the RFSU was a woman called Elise Ottesen Jensen, a Norwegian-Swedish sexual educator, journalist and liberal socialist agitator. Here she is pictured together with Margaret Sanger. In the 1940s, she gathered representatives from various family planning organizations for a meeting in Stockholm, which resulted in the founding of the organization IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Federation, of which she was president for 1959 to 1963. She was also active as editor and responsible publisher of the popular Journal of Psychology and Sexuality. Although Elise Ottesen Jensen was the face of the Swedish eugenics movement, which was masquerading as a sexual education initiative, someone else was driving the social engineering required to push the population in the right direction. Behind the wheel of Western social engineering was Swedish husband and wife, Gunnar and Alva Myrdal. Gunnar and Alva Myrdal's book Crisis in the Population issue from 1934 is one of the most talked about domestic political writings of the 20th century. This book highlights, among other things, the importance of the responsibility for child rearing being shared between parents and society, through trained child educators. Alva was strongly critical of the development within the activities for preschool children in Sweden. Therefore, she published the book Stadsbarn, Children of the City, in 1935, where she presented ideas for a new reformed Swedish preschool, based on modern child psychology. She believed that the childcare of the time, the crib and the kindergartens, were both deficient. She founded the Social Pedagogical Seminary in 1936, where she worked as a teacher in the education of the preschool teachers. Alva said that so far not enough consideration has been given to the latest pedagogical research in preschool teacher education. Thus, her education sought to integrate the new research findings in child psychology into teaching. Social studies were also emphasized, as was the women's personal development. The mental formatting of the Swedish population was picking up speed. In 1938, Alva and Gunnar Myrdal traveled to the United States. In 1941, in the USA, Alva published the book Nation and Family, which was about Swedish family and population policy. During World War II, she also lived periodically in Sweden. Alva Myrdal was strongly involved in the debate on women's liberation. She wanted to create a society where women could participate on equal terms in working life and where men would participate in housework. She believed that such a society would also benefit the children. More manpower in the workforce and destruction of the nuclear family, all at the same time, both in Sweden and the USA. Gunnar Myrdal was a Swedish economist, sociologist, and social democratic politician. Myrdal was part of something called the Stockholm School, which is a term for a group of economists, active from the 1930s and 4 decades onwards. What these economists had in common was that they were influenced by the British economist John Maynard Keynes and the Swede Knut Wicksell. John Maynard Keynes was a member of the Galton Eugenics Institute and was really influenced by the Swede Knut Wicksell. Wicksell is a name most people have never heard of, for obvious reasons. Swedish interests have always had a tendency to act without being seen. In 1944, while in the USA, Gunnar Myrdal authored a scientific study of race relations, funded by the Carnegie Foundation. The study was called An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem and Modern Democracy. Let's take a quote from the study. There is no doubt that the overwhelming majority of white Americans desire that there be as few Negroes as possible in America. If the Negroes could be eliminated from America or greatly decreased in numbers, this would meet the whites' approval, provided that it could be accomplished by means which are also approved. Correspondingly, an increase of the proportion of Negroes in the American population is commonly looked upon as undesirable. White prejudice and discrimination keep the Negro low in standards of living, health, education, manners, and morals. This, in its turn, gives support to white prejudice. White prejudice and Negro standards thus mutually cause each other. One could speculate if the point of this study was really aimed to benefit the black population, or simply a study on how to best achieve the long-term goals of the eugenicists. The black population was growing too fast, and becoming an obvious threat to the agenda, in the eyes of these mad eugenicists. Birth control was no longer considered enough. Thus came the pro-abortion lobby, and finally they managed to get what they wanted, abortions made legal per the Constitution, by the decision in Roe v. Wade. We can at this point certainly state that these insane people promoting eugenics and the current structure of society are all connected historically and dates all the way back to the early 1900s, if not even further. As we've now established, the question of abortion is really a question of promoting the deep state's agenda through eugenics. Now someone might say, but everyone cannot be in on it? No, everyone doesn't have to be. The business side of abortion is a billion-dollar industry. Add to that, the tremendous profits acquired from the sale of aborted and mutilated fetuses. The major benefactors of aborted fetuses is primarily the cosmetics industry and the medical and genetical research industries. Self-serving interests, like we've said before, are much easier to control and follow a specific agenda, as they are driven by their own greed, and cannot grasp the bigger picture. Regardless of your religious, moral, ethical or philosophical stance on abortion, this is about destroying the deep state's agenda and promote the value of human life. There has been 63,459,781 abortions in the USA, since Roe v. Wade. We can no longer turn a blind eye to our history and pretend we didn't know better. The time has now come for the general population to deal with reality. Thank you for listening.
Wow, that's wild. 65 million babies just in the US alone. And I say 65 million because I'm sure by now, when the stocky was made. And let's not talk about every other country. I mean, and you know, when we look at this, it's women, right, that have started this, which is even more scary. Margaret Sanger, in fact, when I've done an interview with her, about her with Kerry Saint from Australia, who's the adoption advocate. So if you guys want to go and catch more information on Margaret Sanger, we've done quite a deep dive into her with Kerry Saint in the past as well. I mean, I find this shocking, but it's making a lot of sense to me, right? Especially when we're looking at the whole, and of course, again, I always maintain, right, there's two sides to the coin. But when we're looking at Sweden, the deep state, the monetary system, Planned Parenthood, all of this happening at the turn of the century, right? At the same time, those designer babies were coming out. And that's what he was saying at the end of the podcast. He said, probably long before. That's when we saw it. That's when it became visible. So it makes me wonder how long these guys have actually been playing around with eugenics. I find the whole abortion lobby and the manipulation behind that absolutely horrific, I have to say. That this woman, well, Margaret Sanger, sorry, was it I can't remember her name now. I thought I wrote it down. The lady they were using in the whole abortion propaganda. And then from one side to the next. I mean, it's just insane how they've been messing with our minds for the longest time. I just sit here thinking, if society was guided differently, right? And not in the ways that we've been manipulated, how could we help young women if they fell pregnant, right? Is abortion the answer? Is adoption the answer? It's just such a crazy conversation, but I'd actually love to have these conversations more. So I'd love to hear you guys' opinion on this, because it has taken on a life of its own now. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you back in half an hour with the Patreons and with members on Zoom for the membership Q&A with Jessie on the Mothers of Darkness we're going to be discussing. And so the link should have gone by now, or it will be going soon, for those who will be joining us for the membership show. Thank you, everybody. And if there's this is the end of this documentary, this series now. So if there's any one of you, if there's another documentary you want us to air on a Friday with Drop In with Chanti, let me know. And we will see what we pop up next week. Take good care, everybody. Have a beautiful weekend. God bless you all, and just stay cool. If this broke something open, if you recognized yourself in the testimony, if your body responded before your mind understood, the next step isn't more information. It's pattern work. Decode what your nervous system built to survive. Dismantle the story that keeps it running. Reorganize through the body and choose from the person you're becoming, not from the pattern that formed when you were too small to choose. That's Solutions. Link below. The body is the record. Let's listen.